The dust has finally decided to settle, returning to the earth like a heavy grey blanket over a bed that was made in violence. And the only sound left in the world is the rhythmic, indifferent lapping of the water against the muddy banks where two great rivers meet. It is the evening of a day that began in the autumn of 1362, and the sun is dipping below the horizon, painting the vast Ukrainian sky in bruises of violet and burnt orange, casting long, distorted shadows across a field that has just changed the shape of the world forever. The air here tastes different now. It is metallic, sharp with the lingering scent of ozone and cooling iron. Yet beneath that acrid top note, there is the ancient, sweet smell of crushed wormwood and damp black soil, the kind of earth that remembers everything but says nothing. You are standing at the edge of the Vodi, the blue waters. Though tonight the waters are not blue. They are murky with the silt of 1,000 rushing hooves and dark with the consequences of a collision that shook the tectonic plates of history. It is quiet here, a silence so profound and heavy that it feels like a physical weight on your chest, the kind of silence that only comes after a deafening noise has suddenly been cut, leaving your ears ringing with the phantom echoes of kettle drums and the screaming of horses. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. Now, close your eyes and let the darkness of your room merge with the twilight of this steppe, feeling the cool wind that rolls off the river, a wind that no longer carries the terror of the Golden Horde, but something new, something that feels dangerously like hope. This is the moment of realization, the precise heartbeat where the invincible myth dissolves into the reality of mortal men. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the collective exhale of a continent that has been holding its breath for 120 years. For over a century, the very grass of this steppe seemed to bow in submission to the east, trembling under the weight of the Mongol war machine, a force of nature that had convinced the world it was as inevitable as the winter and as unstoppable as the tide. But look at the ground now, scattered among the tall, swaying stalks of feather grass, are the remnants of that fear. Broken arrows with fletching of exotic bird feathers, curved sabers dropped in hasty retreat, and the silence of men who woke up this morning believing they were the masters of the earth, only to find themselves sleeping beneath it by sunset. It is a strange thing to witness the corpse of an empire before the historians have even realized it is dead, to stand in the twilight and see that the monsters who demanded tribute and stole the sons of princes were, in the end, just men made of bone and blood who could be outthought, outmaneuvered, and broken. The psychological weight of this moment is heavier than the armor sinking into the river mud. It is the shattering of a psychological ceiling that had kept the Slavic people on their knees, convinced that resistance was a form of suicide. Historians still argue whether the Battle of Blue Waters was truly the military end of the Golden Horde, or merely the symptom of a disease that had been rotting it from the inside for decades. But standing here in the cooling air, the academic distinction feels irrelevant. What matters is the feeling of the vacuum, the sudden absence of the predator. The wolves have been chased from the door, not by a louder roar, but by a cold, calculating silence from the north, and the world feels suddenly larger, as if the map has expanded in the dark while we weren't looking. The rivers, the Snenuka and the Southern Bug, continue to merge and flow southward towards the Black Sea, indifferent to the victory or the defeat, carrying the debris of the battle away from the site, washing the history clean before it can even settle into the textbooks. There is a profound loneliness in this victory, a sense that the old order has been dismantled, but the new one has not yet been built, leaving us in this liminal space, this twilight between the reign of the Khan and the rise of the Duke. The birds are beginning to return cautiously, their calls sounding sharp and intrusive in the heavy quiet, reclaiming the sky that was filled with hissing arrows only hours ago. It is a peaceful scene, deceptively so, masking the reality that this specific silence is the loudest sound Europe has heard since the fall of Kiev. The narrative of history often prefers the noise of the charge, the glory of the clash. But the truth is found in the aftermath, in the quiet moments when the adrenaline fades and the soldiers look at their hands, wondering how they are still moving. Here on the edge of the wild fields, the Deco Pole, the boundary between the settled world of the forest and the chaotic freedom of the steppe, has just shifted. The horizon, once a source of constant anxiety, a place from which doom would ride in on shaggy ponies, has been tamed, at least for tonight. The fear that ruled the lives of grandfathers and fathers, the fear that dictated the architecture of cities and the prayers of mothers, has been proven to be finite. It is a revelation that settles over the land like the dew forming on the cooling grass. A wet, chilling realization that the world is malleable, that destiny is not written in the stars by a Khan in a silk tent, but carved in the mud by men who refuse to be afraid. As the last light fades completely, surrendering the steppe to the embrace of a starless night, the atmosphere shifts from shock to a strange, weary tranquility. The battle is over, but the story of how we arrived at this impossible quiet, how a ghost army from the deep forests of Lithuania walked undetected into the jaw of the dragon and broke its teeth, is a tale that requires us to wind the clock back. We must step away from this riverbank, away from the smell of victory and death, and drift backward through the years to understand the sickness that made the giant vulnerable, to see the cracks forming in the golden armor long before the first sword was swung at blue waters. The night is cool. The crickets are singing the only eulogy the fallen will get, and the stage is set for a retrospective journey into the decay of a superpower. To understand the silence at the river, we must first understand the noise that preceded it, a cacophony not of battle horns, but of whispering voices in the corridors of power, drifting backward in time from the cool mud of the blue waters to the sweltering, opulent tents of Sarai. This was the beating heart of the Golden Horde, a city that floated on the lower Volga like a mirage of silk and terror, a metropolis of nomads who had decided to stop moving just long enough to rule the world. In the middle of the 14th century, to the eyes of a terrified Russian prince or a Genoese merchant, the Horde still appeared as an immutable monolith, a single golden block of authority that stretched from the Carpathian Mountains to the deep pockets of Siberia. They were the apex predators of the geopolitical ecosystem, the masters of the Pax Mongolica, where it was said a virgin carrying a sack of gold could walk from the Danube to the Pacific without being molested, primarily because the Khan's retribution was far more terrifying than any bandit's greed. But empires, Like the great oak trees of the forest or the heavy stars in the night sky, often die from the inside long before they fall, rotting quietly in the center, while the bark remains deceptively strong. The sickness that brought the Horde to its knees at Blue Waters was not a fever of the body, but a fever of the mind, a 20-year nightmare known to history as the Magna Turbatio, or the Great Troubles, a period so chaotic it makes the most complex court dramas seem like simple nursery rhymes. It began, as these tragedies often do, with a father who lived too long and a son who couldn't wait. When the great Khan Jani Beg died in 1357, historians still argue whether he was claimed by natural causes or helped into the afterlife by his ambitious son, Berdi Beg. The first thread was pulled from the tapestry. Berdi Beg, in a display of ruthless efficiency that would have made Machiavelli blush had he been born yet, immediately executed 12 of his own brothers to secure his throne. It was a brutal act of pruning intended to strengthen the family tree, but instead, it poisoned the roots. By killing his potential rivals, he also killed the legitimacy of the line. And when Berdi Beg himself was assassinated just 2 years later, likely by a groomed assassin in the intimacy of his own quarters, the Golden Horde suffered a massive stroke. The central nervous system of the empire was severed, and the body began to thrash in a violent, uncoordinated spasm. What followed was a carousel of death that spun with dizzying speed. In the span of 2 decades, more than 20 different Khans claimed the title. Some ruled for a year, some for a month, and some merely for the time it took to drink a cup of fermented mare's milk that tasted slightly of bitter almonds. The throne of the Batu Khan became the most dangerous seat on earth, a place where men went to die, strangled by bowstrings or smothered with silk pillows by their own generals. This internal hemorrhage paralyzed the once terrifying administrative machine. The Yalik, the portent of authority that Russian princes used to travel thousands of miles to beg for, became a worthless piece of paper, for the Khan who signed it in the morning might be a corpse by the evening prayer. The roads, once kept safe by the terrifying reputation of the Mongol riders, became infested with uncertainty. In Sarai, the air grew thick with paranoia. The great bazaars that smelled of cinnamon and curing leather now smelled of fear. No one knew who to bribe, who to bow to, or whose face would be stamped on the silver dirhams the next day. It was a geopolitical autoimmune disease. The empire's white blood cells attacking its own organs, consuming its energy in a frantic, circular civil war that left the borders unguarded and the treasury bleeding. The great, centralized power that had crushed Kiev and burned Moscow was dissolving into a collection of petty warlords, each clutching a fragment of the shattered mirror and claiming it reflected the whole moon. As the center collapsed, the extremities began to rot. The western territories of the Horde, the vast grassy plains of what is now Ukraine, found themselves effectively orphaned. These lands, the right bank of the Dnieper, drifted away from the chaos of the capital, falling under the sway of 3 powerful, opportunistic emirs, Kutluk Bey, Haji Bey, and the mysterious Prince Dmitri. These men were not of the royal blood of Genghis Khan, but they were survivors, hardened military governors who saw the anarchy in Sarai not as a tragedy, but as a business opportunity. They stopped sending the tax caravans east, keeping the grain, the silver, and the slaves for themselves, growing fat on the tribute of the local Slavic population, while the Khans in the east stabbed each other in the dark. These three warlords became the kings of a lawless frontier, ruling their fiefdoms with a mix of inertia and brutality. They were confident, perhaps arrogant, believing that even a fractured horde was superior to anything the forest people of the north could muster. They viewed the Lithuanians and the Rus not as rivals, but as livestock, unruly perhaps, but ultimately meant to be sheared. But in their isolation, growing comfortable in their regional power, Kutlug, Hadji, and Dmitri failed to notice that the wind had changed. They were looking east toward the burning palaces of Sarai, obsessing over who would sit on the broken throne next, completely missing the shadow that was lengthening from the north. They did not understand that the great troubles had created a vacuum, and nature, in its infinite wisdom, abhors a vacuum. While the Mongols spent their energy looking inward, fighting over the scraps of their grandfather's glory, a different kind of power was coalescing in the deep, freezing forests of Lithuania. It was not a power built on the thundering noise of 10,000 kettle drums or the flash of gold, but on silence, patience, and a terrifyingly cold rationality. The sickness of the Golden Khan had left the door to the treasure house slightly ajar, and while the guards were busy arguing over the keys, a wolf was quietly stepping over the threshold. This wolf was not interested in the pomp of the Khanate or the chaotic drama of succession. He was interested only in the land, the rivers, and the people who lived on them. The disintegration of the Horde was not just a political event. It was a cosmic invitation, a signal flare in the night sky that only one man was astute enough to see. A man who famously kept his own counsel so close that he claimed even his own facial hair was a security risk. While the South was burning in the fever of its own succession crisis, the North was freezing in a silence that was deliberate, calculated, and terrifyingly disciplined. Far away from the sun-baked mud bricks of Sarai, deep within the primeval, moss-draped forests of Lithuania, a different kind of court was being held, one where the walls were made of rough-hewn timber, and the air smelled of pine resin, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of sharpened steel. Here, in the shadowy capital of Vilnius, ruled a man who was the antithesis of the flamboyant, silk-clad Khans, Grand Duke Algirdas. To understand why the Golden Horde fell, one must look into the eyes of this man, a figure who seems to have stepped out of a grim fairy tale, a ruler who moved through history like a phantom in a winter storm. Algirdas was an anomaly in medieval Europe, a ghost in the machine of Christendom. He was the sovereign of the last pagan empire on the continent, a man who knelt before the sacred eternal fire of the Romovar faith rather than the cross or the crescent. But it was not his religion that frightened his enemies. It was his mind, a labyrinth of secrets so complex and guarded that it became the stuff of legend. He was a man of profound, unsettling intensity, a ruler who famously declared that he would pull out his own beard hair by hair if he thought it knew his plans. A statement that was less a joke and more a chilling manifesto of operational security. In an age where kings proclaimed their intentions with trumpets and heralds, Algirdas weaponized silence, wrapping his ambitions in a fog of war before the war had even begun. Unlike the Khans who feasted on roasted horse meat and fermented mare's milk until they fell into a stupor, or the Western kings who drowned their anxieties in goblets of heavy red wine, Algirdas possessed a sobriety that was almost inhuman. He drank only water, a habit that unnerved his contemporaries, who could not understand a man who refused to dull his senses, even for a moment. This absolute sobriety meant that while his rivals were sleeping off the excesses of the night before, Algirdas was awake, staring into the embers of the hearth, pushing invisible armies across the map of his mind, calculating logistics, distances, and the breaking points of empires. He was a monk of war, ascetic and focused, wearing simple clothes that betrayed no sign of his immense power, blending in with his soldiers until the moment he chose to strike. He understood that the greatest weapon in his arsenal was not the sword, but the unknown. If the enemy did not know where he was or what he was thinking, they could not defend against him. This psychological warfare created an aura of omnipresence. The Mongol warlords in the south, growing fat on their own corruption, had no idea that a predator in the north was watching them with the unblinking patience of a wolf waiting for the shepherd to fall asleep. Historians still argue whether Algirdas was a devout pagan who genuinely believed in the thunder god Perkunas, or a supreme pragmatist who used the old religion as a political tool to maintain the fierce loyalty of his ethnic Lithuanian core while simultaneously courting the Orthodox Christians of the Rus lands. Regardless of his private theology, his public genius was undeniable. He managed a delicate balancing act that would have shattered a lesser man. To the west, the fanatical Teutonic knights, clad in white cloaks and righteous fury, were constantly hammering at his borders, demanding his conversion or his extermination. Most rulers would have been consumed by this existential threat, pinning all their resources to the Western Wall to hold back the chaotic tide of the Crusades. But Algirdas did something that defied conventional military wisdom, something that bordered on madness. He turned his back on the Crusaders, trusting his brother, the fiercely loyal and equally capable Kęstutis, to hold the shield in the west. Algirdas took the sword and turned his face to the south and east. It was a gamble of breathtaking audacity, a decision to ignore the enemy at the gate in order to hunt the monster in the backyard. He saw what no one else dared to see, that the invincible Golden Horde was a paper tiger, terrifying to look at, but tearing apart at the seams. The atmosphere in Vilnius during these years of preparation must have been electric with suppressed energy, a coiled spring waiting to snap. The Grand Duke did not issue grand proclamations or rally his troops with shouting speeches. Instead, he worked through a network of spies and envoys, moving pieces on the geopolitical chessboard with a touch so light it was barely felt. He was building a coalition, not through coercion, but through a shared hunger for liberation. He knew that the Rus principalities, the lands of modern-day Ukraine and Belarus, were tired. They were exhausted by the Mongol yoke, drained by the taxes, and humiliated by the requirement to bow before the Khans. Algirdas, with his water-clear eyes and his quiet voice, offered them an alternative that was irresistible in its simplicity. He did not come as a conqueror to replace one tyranny with another. He came as a partner, a strange pagan uncle who promised to drive away the bullies if they would simply agree to walk with him. He was constructing an empire of integration, a soft conquest that relied as much on diplomacy as it did on the lance. As he prepared his forces, the contrast between the two colliding worlds could not have been starker. In the south, the steppe warlords shouted over each other, their councils devolving into brawls, their strategies dictated by ego and immediate greed. In the north, Algirdas whispered, He gathered his heavy cavalry, men who rode on massive chargers bred to crush bones, and his light infantry, who could move through the forests like shadows. He checked the supply lines, the grain stores, the fodder for the horses, attending to the boring, unglamorous details that win wars while the poets write about heroes. He was a man who understood that a broken horseshoe could lose a kingdom, and so he checked the horseshoes. The wolf of the north was ready to leave his den, and he would do so without a sound. There were no great bonfires to signal the march, no trumpets to announce the departure. One morning, the mist simply cleared from the Lithuanian forests, and the army was gone, slipping into the green ocean of the Ukrainian wilderness, moving south toward the blue waters, toward a destiny that the Golden Horde, in their noisy arrogance, never saw coming until the steel was already at their throats. The beard had kept its secrets well, and now the world was about to learn what Algirdas had been thinking all along. To conquer a city with fire requires an army, but to conquer a city with a whisper requires a genius. And Algirdas understood that the strongest walls are not made of stone, but of the loyalty of the people hiding behind them. As the Lithuanian army moved south, emerging from the dense canopy of the northern forests into the fragmented principalities of the Rus, the invasion did not look like an invasion at all. It looked, strangely, like a homecoming. For generations, the Slavic cities of the region, Vitebsk, Minsk, and the outskirts of Kiev, had lived in a state of suspended terror, their gates barred against the chaotic violence of the Golden Horde, their church bells silenced whenever the dust clouds of Mongol tax collectors appeared on the horizon. The people were accustomed to the Basaks, the Mongol officials who treated the land like a lemon to be squeezed until the rind broke, demanding tribute in silver, furs, and blood. So when the sentries on the wooden ramparts of the Rus cities saw the banners of Algirdas approaching, they tightened their grip on their spears, expecting the usual medieval transaction, a siege, a sack, and a slaughter. But the battering rams never came. Instead, lone riders approached the gates, not with torches, but with parchment, bearing a message that was so radical in its simplicity, it must have seemed like a trick. The Grand Duke offered a proposition that sounded less like the demand of a conqueror, and more like the contract of a pragmatic landlord. Open your gates, pay your taxes to Vilnius instead of Sarai, and in exchange, absolutely nothing about your daily life will change. This was the masterstroke of the soft conquest, a strategy of integration that stood in stark contrast to the brutal imposition of the Mongols. Algirdas, a pagan who prayed to the thunder, looked into the eyes of the Orthodox Christian princes and spoke the famous phrase that would become the motto of the Lithuanian expansion. We introduce no new customs and change no old ones. It was a promise of cultural non-aggression, a guarantee that the church bells could keep ringing, the priests could keep chanting in Old Church Slavonic, and the local boyars could keep their titles and their lands. It was a brilliant recognition of the human desire for stability. Algirdas realized that men will fight to the death to protect their gods and their grandfathers' laws, but they will happily switch tax brackets if it means they can sleep soundly at night. He did not ask them to become Lithuanian. He simply asked them to stop being Mongol subjects. This approach turned the invasion into a liberation, a geopolitical magic trick where the invader was greeted with bread and salt rather than boiling oil. The contrast was so sharp It was almost comical. The Mongols had set the bar for governance so low, essentially, pay us or we burn your house down, that Algirdas only had to offer basic protection and a reasonable tax rate to be hailed as a savior. Historians still argue whether this policy was born of genuine tolerance or cold, calculating indifference, whether Algirdas respected the Orthodox faith or simply didn't care enough about it to waste soldiers converting people. But the effect was the same. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania began to absorb the Rus lands, not like a wolf eating a sheep, but like a sponge soaking up water. The conquest was so gentle that the conquerors themselves began to change. The rough pagan warriors of the north, clad in wolfskins and leather, found themselves seduced by the sophisticated culture of the Rus cities they occupied. They began to marry local princesses, adopt Slavic names, and listen to the hauntingly beautiful liturgies of the Eastern Church. Algirdas himself, though he remained steadfastly pagan until the end, married twice, both times to Orthodox princesses, Maria of Vitebsk and Uliana of Tver. These were not just diplomatic alliances. They were signals to the population that the new boss was part of the family. He sat in their halls, drank their mead, and listened to their complaints about the Mongols, nodding with the sympathetic ear of a man who shared their enemy. The fear that usually accompanies the arrival of a foreign army evaporated, replaced by a strange, tentative optimism, a feeling that perhaps the long night of the steppe dominion was finally breaking. As the army moved deeper into the territory, rolling towards the borders of the Golden Horde's influence, the composition of the force began to change. It was no longer just a Lithuanian army. It was becoming a coalition. The local Rus regiments, men who had spent their lives hiding their swords in the thatch of their roofs to avoid Mongol confiscation, dusted off their armor and joined the march. They were eager, hungry for revenge against the oppressors who had humiliated their fathers, and they saw in Algirdas a vessel for that vengeance. The wolf of the north was gathering a pack, and it was a diverse, motley collection of heavy knights, forest hunters, and disgruntled Slavic infantry, all bound together not by fear of their leader, but by a shared hatred of the Golden Horde. The logistics of this expansion were handled with the same quiet efficiency. There was no looting, no burning of fields, because Algirdas knew that a starving peasant pays no taxes. He treated the land as an asset to be managed, not a prize to be plundered. The markets remained open, the trade routes remained secure, and the silver flowed north to Vilnius, funding the very war machine that was protecting the trade. It was a self-sustaining cycle of conquest, an economic engine that grew stronger with every mile it advanced. The atmosphere in these liberated cities was one of surreal relief, a sudden depressurization. Imagine the feeling of a city that has spent 100 years holding its breath, waiting for the next blow, suddenly being told to exhale. The heavy iron medallions of the Khan's authority, the paitsa, were thrown into the rivers or melted down, the symbols of submission erased from the public squares. In the churches, the prayers changed. Instead of praying for deliverance from the godless Tatars, they prayed for the health of the Grand Duke, a man who didn't even believe in their god, but was kind enough to let them worship him. It was a time of strange bedfellows, of pagan and Christian standing shoulder to shoulder on the ramparts, looking south toward the vast open steppe where the Golden Horde waited. The psychological victory had already been won. Algirdas had stolen the hearts and minds of the buffer states without fighting a major battle. But he knew, and his new subjects knew, that the true test was yet to come. The soft conquest had secured the rear, but the hard conquest, the collision with the main force of the three Tatar warlords, was inevitable. The velvet glove had done its work. Now, as the army approached the border of the wild fields, it was time to reveal the iron fist hidden beneath it. The cities were safe, the supply lines were secure, and the Rus regiments were marching in step with the Lithuanians. The stage was set, not for a negotiation, but for a reckoning. To leave the forest is to leave the womb. To enter the steppe is to walk naked into the gaze of the sun. As the coalition army pushed further south, leaving the sheltering canopy of the pines and oaks behind, they entered a landscape that was as alien to the forest-dwelling Lithuanians as the surface of the moon. The Ukrainian steppe, a vast, rolling expanse of grassland known poetically as the Green Ocean. Here, the grass grew so tall and thick that it could swallow a man whole, and a rider on horseback appeared as a mere head, floating on a swaying emerald tide. The horizon ceased to be a line broken by trees and became an infinite, terrifying curve, a reminder of just how small a man is against the scale of the world. Moving an army through this terrain was a logistical nightmare that bordered on the impossible. In the medieval world, armies were loud, lumbering beasts that chewed up the land they walked on, announcing their presence with columns of dust that could be seen for 20 miles. But Algirdas did not lead a beast. He led a phantom. The march south was a masterclass in operational discipline, a silent migration that moved with the fluid grace of a shadow passing over the earth. The logistics of this movement were handled with a precision that would baffle modern quartermasters. Thousands of horses, both the heavy destriers of the knights and the sturdy, shaggy mounts of the light cavalry, required oceans of water and mountains of fodder. Yet, the army moved without the bloated baggage trains that slowed down Western crusades. They lived off the land, but carefully, grazing the horses on the rich steppe grass that waved around them, turning the obstacle of the terrain into their fuel source. Algirdas enforced a silence that was almost religious. There were no camp songs, no shouting matches over dice, and crucially, no large fires at night that could betray their position to the keen eyes of a Mongol scout. The men ate cold rations, dried meat and hard bread, huddled in the darkness, speaking in whispers, conscious that they were walking into the bedroom of a sleeping giant. The paranoia of the Grand Duke, his obsession with secrecy, filtered down to the lowest foot soldier. They understood that their lives depended on their invisibility. They were ghosts haunting the high grass, moving only when the wind moved, blending their noise with the rustling of the stalks. Historians still argue whether the Mongols' failure to detect this massive force was due to Algirdas's supernatural stealth, or simply the sheer incompetence of the Golden Horde's fractured leadership. It is likely a combination of both. While the Tatar warlords were busy staring at each other in the south, blinding themselves with civil war, they had pulled their eyes off the northern horizon. They had neglected the eyes of the steppe, the network of scouts and watchtowers that had once made their borders impenetrable. Algirdas exploited this blindness ruthlessly. He navigated the wild fields, the Dikopole, using the rivers as his guides, keeping the water on his flank to ensure that no enemy could surprise him from at least one direction. The Dnieper and the Bug became his highways, the sound of the rushing water masking the tramp of thousands of boots and hooves. It was a journey of sensory deprivation and overload simultaneously. The heat was a physical weight, the air humming with the sound of millions of insects, a constant, low-frequency drone that drilled into the nerves. The smell of wild thyme, sage, and sweating horses created a thick, heady perfume that would forever remind the veterans of this campaign of the summer they walked into hell. There is a specific kind of courage required to march into an open plain against an enemy famous for their cavalry. In the forest, a man can hide behind a tree. In a castle, he can hide behind a wall. But in the green ocean, there is nowhere to hide. If the Mongols appeared, there would be no retreat, no cover, only the geometry of death on the open grass. The Lithuanian knights, accustomed to the claustrophobic brawls of the woodlands, had to suppress the agoraphobia that comes with total exposure. They trusted Algirdas not because he was warm or charismatic, but because he seemed to know the land better than the mapmakers. He moved them in dispersed columns to minimize the dust, converging only when necessary, a tactic that mimicked the fluid warfare of the Mongols themselves. He was beating them by becoming them, adapting his heavy European warfare to the fluid dynamics of the steppe. As the days turned into weeks, the tension within the ranks tightened like a bowstring. They were deep in enemy territory now, far beyond the safety of the last friendly outpost. Every rustle in the grass, every sudden flight of birds, sent hands reaching for sword hilts. The psychological pressure of the unseen enemy was immense. They expected the horizon to darken with the Horde at any moment, to hear the shrill whistles of the Tatar arrows. But the horizon remained empty, a flat line separating the blue sky from the green earth. They were walking through a blind spot in history, a window of opportunity that had opened for the first time in a century. Algirdas was guiding them not just toward a battle, but toward a specific, vulnerable point in the Mongol infrastructure. He wasn't just marching to fight, he was marching to strangle. As the rivers began to converge and the smell of the Black Sea drifted faintly on the southern breeze, the army realized they weren't just invaders. They were thieves in the night, poised to steal the very lifeblood of the Golden Horde before the warlords even woke up to check their pockets. The silence of the march was about to end, replaced by the ringing of gold and the screams of a treasury being looted. War, in its most primitive form, is a contest of blood, but empire is a contest of math. And Algirdas understood that the Golden Horde did not run on the courage of its warriors, but on the silver in its saddlebags. As the silent army secured the borderlands, the Grand Duke did not immediately seek a field of battle. Instead, he struck a blow against the invisible arteries that kept the Mongol heart beating. For decades, the Basaks, the dreaded Mongol tax collectors, had been the true agents of the occupation. They were the men who rode into villages with ledgers and scales, weighing the grain, counting the livestock, and demanding the tithe of the steppe. To the peasant in the field or the merchant in the market, the Basak was a figure of more immediate terror than the Khan himself. The Khan was a distant rumor, but the Basak was the hand in your pocket, the man who could sell your children into slavery if the harvest was light. Algirdas, with the precision of a surgeon cutting out a tumor, gave the order to dismantle this infrastructure. It was not a chaotic purge, but a systematic eviction. In the towns along the Dnieper, the Mongol officials were rounded up, relieved of their collected silver, and unceremoniously escorted to the edge of the territory with a simple message: "Tell your masters the bank is closed." This was economic warfare of the highest order, a siege on the wallet that hit the warlords where they were most vulnerable. You must understand that the three rulers of the Western Horde, Kutluk Bey, Haji Bey, and the enigmatic Dmitri, were not living the ascetic lives of their nomad ancestors. They had grown accustomed to the soft luxuries that tribute bought: the silk from China, the wine from Crimea, the intricate goldwork of the Caucasus. Their power base relied on their ability to distribute wealth to their lieutenants. Without the steady flow of tribute from the Russlands, their loyalty networks would begin to dissolve like sugar in hot water. By cutting off the revenue stream, Algirdas was not just insulting them, he was starving them. The silver that should have been flowing south to fund their feasts and their bodyguards was now staying in the north, or worse, being used to feed the very army that was coming to kill them. It was a masterstroke that forced the enemy's hand. The warlords could ignore a border raid. They could ignore a diplomatic snub. But they could not ignore the sudden emptiness of their treasury. Historians still argue whether the Dmitri mentioned in the chronicles as one of the three commanders was a renegade Rurikid prince who had turned traitor to serve the Mongols, or a Tatar warlord who had merely adopted a Christian name to better rule his Slavic subjects. Whatever his origin, he, along with Kutlug and Haji, realized that the great troubles of the succession crisis had to be put on hold. The threat from the north had become existential. The internal bickering that had paralyzed the Horde for 20 years evaporated in the face of this brazen theft. It is a strange irony that Algirdas, by attacking them, accomplished what no Mongol Khan had managed to do in decades. He united them. The three warlords ceased their infighting, their petty squabbles over grazing rights and titles, and turned their collective gaze northward. The sleeping dragon had not just been poked, it had been robbed, and its reaction was predictable, violent, and swift. The atmosphere in the southern camps shifted instantly from indolence to industry. The green ocean began to churn. Messengers rode fast horses between the yurts of the three leaders, carrying arrows dipped in red paint, the traditional summons to war. The blacksmiths stoked their fires, hammering the dents out of armor that had been used more often for ceremonial parades than for combat in recent years. The air was filled with the guttural commands of sergeants and the shrill whinnying of thousands of fresh mounts being driven in from the herds. It was the waking of a military machine that, despite its recent decay, was still the most terrifying force the world had ever known. The Golden Horde was mobilizing, and the ground began to tremble, literally, under the gathering weight of their numbers. They were not marching to collect taxes this time. They were marching to exterminate the forest bandits who had dared to touch their gold. Algirdas, waiting in the cool shadows of the river valleys, knew they were coming. In fact, he was counting on it. He had provoked them deliberately, drawing them out of their fortified encampments and deep territories into a space of his choosing. He knew that if he tried to chase the Mongols across the endless steppe, his army would die of thirst and exhaustion, chasing smoke in the wind. He needed them to come to him, to commit to a location where their mobility could be constrained. By choking their economy, he had baited the hook with the one thing they could not resist. The intelligence reports began to trickle in from his own scouts. Dust clouds on the horizon, the smoke of 1,000 campfires moving north, the sheer noise of a migration of vengeance. The silence of the Lithuanian march was now being answered by the roar of the steppe. The game of cat and mouse was over. The trap was set, and the three lions were walking right into it, blinded by their rage and the arrogance of a century of dominance. They believed they were riding to punish a thief. They did not realize they were riding to their own funeral. The coin had been tossed, and now, at the confluence of the rivers, it was about to land. The meeting point was not chosen by chance, but carved by geography. A Y-shaped scar in the earth where the rivers Snenuka and Southern Bug collided. This place, known as the Sini Fodi, or Blue Waters, was a natural amphitheater for violence, a flat expanse of floodplain hemmed in by the gently curving arms of the rivers. It was here, under the pale, expansive sky of early autumn, that the two tectonic plates of Eurasia finally ground against each other. The atmosphere on the day of convergence was heavy, with a strange vibrating tension, as if the air itself was struggling to hold the pressure of what was about to happen. From the south, the Golden Horde arrived not as an army, but as a weather system. A dark, roiling storm front of horses, banners, and noise that stretched from horizon to horizon. They brought with them the music of the steppe, the rhythmic thrumming of kettle drums that beat in time with the heart, the eerie whistling arrows designed to terrify, and the chaotic shouting of men who had never known defeat in open battle. To the Lithuanian scouts watching from the riverbanks, it must have looked like the end of the world was riding toward them. On the other side of the field, the silence of the north held its ground. Algirdas had arrayed his forces with a stillness that was almost unnatural. The Grand Duke sat on his horse, a figure of calm geometry amidst the chaos of nature. He watched the Mongol Ocean pour into the valley, his eyes scanning the enemy lines not with fear, but with the detached curiosity of an architect studying a structural flaw. He saw the three distinct banners of the warlords, Kutlug, Haji, and Dmitri, fluttering in the wind, marking the three separate commands of the Horde. This was the critical weakness he had anticipated. A hydra with three heads is terrifying, but it is also uncoordinated. The Mongol force was massive, significantly outnumbering the Lithuanians, but it was a coalition of rivals, bound together by greed rather than loyalty. Algirdas knew that if he could strike hard enough, the cracks between them would widen into chasms. The geography of the Blue Waters was the third participant in this battle, a silent ally that Algirdas had courted long before the first arrow was nocked. The rivers were not just boundaries, they were walls. By positioning his army with the water protecting his flanks, Algirdas had neutralized the Mongols' greatest weapon, the Tulugma. This was the legendary standard sweep maneuver, where the mobile Mongol light cavalry would race around the enemy's sides, encircling them in a ring of death. But here, the riverbanks denied them that space. To flank the Lithuanians, the Mongols would have to ride into the water, bogging down their ponies in the deep mud and swift currents. The Grand Duke had forced the masters of mobile warfare into a frontal confrontation, a claustrophobic brawl where their speed counted for nothing and their numbers became a liability, clogging the field rather than overwhelming it. As the two armies stared each other down across the grassy no-man's land, the psychological weight of the moment settled in. For the Rus soldiers in Algirdas's ranks, this was the moment of truth. They were looking into the faces of the men who had burned their cities and enslaved their kin. The fear in their stomachs was a cold, hard stone, but it was matched by a desperate, burning hope. They knew that there was no running from this field. Behind them lay the river, and in front of them lay the Horde. They were trapped in the death ground, described by ancient strategists, ground where men fight with the ferocity of the doomed, because survival is only possible through victory. Algirdas rode along the lines, not shouting, but speaking in that low, intense voice of his, reminding them that the men across the field were not demons, but flesh. He pointed out the disorder in the Mongol ranks, the way the three warlords were jostling for position, each wanting the glory of the first charge. "See them," he might have whispered. "They are already fighting each other." Historians still argue about the exact numbers present at Blue Waters, with estimates ranging from 20,000 to over 80,000. But the consensus is that the Mongols held a significant numerical advantage. Yet numbers are a deceptive metric in war. The Horde was a blunt instrument, a sledgehammer swung with terrifying force but little precision. Algirdas had brought a scalpel. He had organized his army not into a single mass, but into 6 distinct regiments, arranged in a concave, half-moon formation. This was a trap made of men, a cup designed to catch the Mongol charge and then close around it. The center was the bait, the anvil of heavy infantry and Rus spearmen, anchored by pavise shields, tall rectangular wooden walls that could stand on their own. Behind this wall, the Lithuanian crossbowmen waited, their bolts capable of punching through the heavy, lamellar armor of the Tatar nobles. The sun began to climb higher, burning off the morning mist, and the colors of the banners became vivid, the gold and blue of the Horde, the red and white of the Lithuanians. The noise of the Mongols grew louder, a crescendo of intimidation designed to break the enemy's nerve before the first blow. But the northern line remained silent, a wall of iron and wood that refused to tremble. The singing waters of the river rushed by, indifferent to the posturing of men, carrying the fallen leaves of autumn toward the sea. The stage was set for a collision of eras. The nomadic storm was about to break against the immovable object of the feudal wall. Algirdas raised his hand, not to signal a charge, but to signal the hold. He would not give them the satisfaction of the first move. He would wait, like the stone waits for the wave, letting the Horde exhaust its fury against his discipline. And then, when the tide receded, he would drown them. The battle began not with a charge, but with the sky turning dark. The Mongol archers, masters of the composite bow, rode forward in waves, unleashing a storm of arrows that hissed through the air like a swarm of angry wasps. This was the opening argument of every step battle. A deluge of death designed to panic the enemy, to force them to break formation and scatter like frightened deer. But Algirdas had prepared his men for this specific terror. The Rus infantry, standing in the front ranks, raised their pavise shields, creating a sudden interlocking roof of the wood over their heads. The arrows drummed against the shields like hail on a tin roof, a chaotic rhythm of thuds and snaps. But the line did not waver. The men huddled beneath the timber, listening to the death rain down inches from their skulls, breathing in the smell of sawdust and sweat. They were the anvil, and an anvil does not move when it is struck. Seeing that their arrow storm had failed to scatter the forest bandits, the Mongol warlords signaled the next phase, the feigned retreat. This was the oldest trick in the book, a maneuver as natural to the Mongols as breathing. A wing of their cavalry charged forward, clashed briefly with the Lithuanian line, and then suddenly turned and fled in apparent panic, screaming and throwing down their weapons. It was a seductive invitation. "Look, we are broken. Chase us and claim your victory." In 100 battles before this one, European knights had fallen for it, breaking their ranks to pursue the fleeing enemy, only to be surrounded and slaughtered when the fleeing Mongols suddenly turned and fired backward with deadly precision. But Algirdas held his army in an iron grip. As the Mongols fled, the Lithuanian line remained frozen. Not a single horse moved forward. Not a single foot soldier broke the shield wall. The discipline was absolute, a terrifying testament to the control Algirdas held over his diverse coalition. The Mongols, confused by an enemy that refused to play by the script, wheeled around and reformed. The psychological momentum began to shift. The invincible tactics were failing against this wall of silence. Frustrated and impatient, Kutluk Bey and his fellow warlords ordered the full assault. The entire weight of the Golden Horde's center crashed into the Lithuanian formation. The impact was sickening, a cacophony of shattering lances, screaming horses, and the dull crunch of steel on bone. But this is where the genius of Algirdas's half-moon formation revealed itself. As the Mongols pushed into the center, driving the Rus infantry back step by agonizing step, they did not realize they were walking into a mouth that was slowly closing. The Lithuanian wings, anchored safely by the rivers, began to curve inward. It was the Tulugma reversed. Instead of the Mongols encircling the enemy was encircling them. The concave formation acted like a flexible net. The deeper the Mongols pushed into the center, the tighter the flanks squeezed them from the sides. The battlefield became a claustrophobic crush. The Mongol riders, accustomed to the open freedom of the steppe, where they could maneuver and space themselves out, suddenly found themselves packed shoulder to shoulder. Unable to swing their sabers or turn their horses, they were trapped in a kill box of their own making, pressed against the shields of the Rus infantry in front and hemmed in by the Lithuanian knights on the sides. Algirdas watched from his vantage point, his face impassive, but his mind racing. He saw the confusion rippling through the Mongol ranks, the way the horses were rearing in panic as the space tightened. He saw the three warlords losing control of their men, their commands drowned out by the noise of the crush. This was the geometry of death he had planned for, using the enemy's own aggression to suffocate them. The crescent moon was becoming a full circle, a ring of steel that was slowly tightening around the throat of the Golden Horde. The hunters had become the prey, trapped in a cage of river, shield, and sword. The air grew thick with dust and desperation, and in the center of the press, the realization began to dawn on the Mongol riders. There was nowhere to go. The open steppe was behind them, but the way was blocked by their own comrades pushing forward, unaware that they were marching into a meat grinder. The trap had snapped shut. Time on a battlefield is not measured in minutes or hours, but in heartbeats and the terrifying gaps between breaths. For the men standing in the center of Algirdas's crescent formation, the iron wall of the coalition army, the afternoon stretched into an eternity of noise and endurance. To stand in a shield wall is to submit to a horrifying paradox. You are safest when you are shoulder to shoulder with your neighbor, creating a single organism of wood and flesh. Yet every instinct in your mammalian brain is screaming at you to run, to scatter, to be anywhere but in the path of the avalanche. The Russ infantrymen, gripping their heavy Bavis shields with white-knuckled desperation, were no longer fighting a human enemy. They were fighting the urge to survive. The air around them was thick with the black rain of the steppe, a relentless downpour of arrows that did not fall like natural rain, but struck with the velocity of malice. The sound was a continuous dry rattling, thwack, thwack, crack, as iron bodkin points bit into the seasoned timber of the shields. Occasionally, a sickening wet thud would punctuate the rhythm, followed by a sharp cry or a gurgle, marking where a shaft had found a gap in the armor or a throat exposed for a split second. But the line did not break. When a man fell, dragged backward into the mud by his comrades, another stepped forward from the rear ranks to fill the void, sealing the wall as if the army itself were healing a wound in real time. The psychological pressure of this bombardment cannot be overstated. The Mongols were masters of sonic warfare. They attached small, hollow bone whistles to their arrows, which caused them to scream as they flew through the air. This created a terrifying, discordant shriek that sounded like the sky itself was tearing apart, a noise designed to unnerve the horses and liquefy the bowels of the men below. It was a test of nerve as much as armor. The soldiers in the front rank had to trust that the wood would hold, that the man to their left would not flee, and that the Grand Duke behind them knew what he was doing. They stood in a twilight world of dust and splinters, seeing only the backs of the shields in front of them, or the terrified eyes of the enemy through the narrow viewing slits. The heat was suffocating, a heavy, wet blanket of humidity rising from the river, and the sweating bodies of thousands of men packed into a tight geographic box. Thirst became a physical agony, a sharp pain in the throat that rivaled the fear of the blade, yet no one reached for a water skin. To drop your guard for a second was to invite death. Historians still argue whether the infantry at the center of the line were primarily local Rus levies, fighting with the desperate fury of men defending their own soil, or elite Lithuanian foot soldiers trained in the Western style of static defense. It is likely a blend of both, a fusion of the heavy, stubborn Slavic temperament and the disciplined professional drill of the Baltic North. Whatever their origin, they functioned as the perfect anvil. They absorbed the kinetic energy of the Golden Horde, taking the blows that would have shattered a lesser force. The Mongols, frustrated by the ineffectiveness of their arrows against the Pavise wall, began to commit to the melee. They rode their horses right up to the shield wall, stabbing downward with lances and slashing with curved sabers, trying to hack their way through the wood. The battle devolved into a brutal, intimate crush. Men looked directly into the faces of their killers, smelling the fermented mare's milk on their breath, seeing the sweat streaking through the dust on their cheeks. It was a grinder of meat and iron, a place where skill mattered less than the sheer will to remain standing. The sensory overload was absolute. The ground beneath their boots turned into a slurry of mud and blood, slippery and treacherous. The roar of the battle was a physical vibration that rattled the teeth. The clashing of steel, the screaming of maimed horses, the guttural war cries of the Tatars invoking the eternal blue sky, and the deep, rhythmic chanting of the Rus soldiers calling upon Christ and the Virgin. Amidst this chaos, the discipline of the Iron Wall was the only thing keeping the army from annihilation. Algirdas had drilled into them the concept of the statue, the idea that until the command was given, they were not men, but stone. They were not to chase, they were not to retreat, they were not to think, they were simply to be. This stillness was the most unnerving thing for the Mongols. The steppe warriors were used to an enemy that moved, that reacted, that panicked. To fight men who stood like statues, absorbing violence without returning it, was deeply unsettling. It disrupted the rhythm of the steppe warfare, which relied on flow and movement. The Mongols were like water crashing against a rock. They could foam and roar, but they could not move the rock, and with every wave, they lost a little more of their momentum. As the afternoon wore on, the dynamic of the battle began to shift imperceptibly. The quiver of the Golden Horde was not bottomless. The arrows, once a torrent, began to thin into a trickle. The horses of the Horde, driven hard since dawn, and now trapped in the crushing press of the center, began to tire, their flanks heaving, their mouths frothing. The Mongols were exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. They had thrown their best punches, the arrow storm, the feigned retreat, the heavy charge, and the enemy was still there, standing behind their splintered shields, watching, waiting. The frustration in the Mongol ranks was palpable. The warlords were screaming orders that could no longer be executed by tired men and frightened beasts. They had lost the initiative. The green ocean of the steppe had always been their ally, giving them space to dance around their slower foes. But here, the river and the wall had denied them the dance. They were stuck in a brawl they couldn't win. A static, grinding match that favored the heavy armor and big shields of the Europeans. Deep within the Lithuanian formation, the mood was changing from desperation to a grim, cold resolve. The soldiers could feel the slackening of the enemy's pressure. The blows were coming slower, with less force. The screaming of the whistle arrows had faded, replaced by the heavy, ragged breathing of two armies locked in a clinch. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long, golden beams across the devastation, illuminating the piles of broken shafts and fallen bodies. The iron wall was battered, chipped, and stained crimson, but it was unbroken. The anvil had done its job. It had held the metal in place, enduring the heat and the hammering without cracking. Now, the men in the front lines, wiping the sweat from their eyes, sensed that the time for endurance was ending. They could feel a vibration in the ground behind them, a low rhythmic thunder that had nothing to do with the Mongols. It was the sound of the reserves, the fresh, heavy power that Algirdas had been holding back for this precise moment. The anvil had held. It was time for the hammer to fall. The dust of the battle had barely settled on the banks of the blue waters before the news began to race ahead of the army, carried by the wind and the terrified whispers of fleeing Mongol stragglers. The Golden Horde was broken. The invincible Khans were running south, their banners trailing in the mud, leaving the lands of the Rus unguarded for the first time in human memory. Algirdas did not waste time celebrating on the field of victory. He understood that momentum is a perishable commodity. The army reformed, tired but electrified by the realization of what they had done, and turned their eyes towards the ultimate prize, Kiev. For over a century, Kiev had been a ghost of its former self, a city living in the shadow of its own burned ruins, paying humiliating tribute to the steppes, its golden domes tarnished by neglect and fear. It was the spiritual heart of the East Slavic world, a symbol of legitimacy and power. And now, it was waiting for a liberator. The march to Kiev was less a military campaign and more a victory lap. As the Lithuanian coalition moved through the countryside, the fortified towns that would have normally barred their gates threw them open. There were no sieges, no starving out of garrisons. The local princes and boyars, hearing of the destruction of the three warlords, realized that the geopolitical weather had changed. They rode out to meet Algirdas, not with swords, but with bread and salt, the traditional Slavic offering of hospitality. They saw in him not a foreign invader, but a shield against the chaos of the East. The soft conquest had reached its zenith. Algirdas was conquering the land by simply walking into it, his reputation doing the work of 1,000 battering rams. He was the wolf who had killed the predator, and the flock was more than happy to accept a new shepherd. When the army finally crested the hills overlooking the Dnieper and saw the silhouette of Kiev against the sky, a hush fell over the ranks. Even in its diminished state, the city was majestic, the sunlight glinting off the domes of St. Sophia Cathedral, a beacon of civilization that had survived the Mongol firestorm of 1240. But as they approached the Golden Gate, the legendary entrance to the city, there was a tense moment of uncertainty. Would the Mongol garrison fight? Would the city elders resist a pagan ruler? The answer came when the heavy timber gates creaked open, revealing not a line of archers, but a procession of priests carrying icons and swinging censers of incense. The Metropolitan of Kiev, the spiritual leader of the Rus, came out to meet the pagan Grand Duke. It was a scene of profound historical irony, the Orthodox Church welcoming a fire worshipper as their savior. But Algirdas, ever the pragmatist, dismounted from his war horse and bowed his head, showing respect to their god, cementing the alliance between the pagan sword and the Christian cross. The entry into Kiev was a moment of catharsis for the population. For generations, they had lived with the Barsaks, looking over their shoulders. Now they watched as the Mongol emblems were torn down from the administrative buildings. The Yarliks, the patents of authority signed by the Khans, were gathered in the public squares and burned, the smoke rising as a black signal that the era of the Golden Horde was over. Algirdas installed his son, Vladimir, as the new Prince of Kiev, a brilliant move that placed a ruler of the Rurikid bloodline, through his mother, on the throne, satisfying the locals' desire for legitimacy, while keeping the city firmly under the control of Vilnius. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania had ceased to be merely a Baltic forest state. It had transformed almost overnight into an imperial power that stretched from the freezing waters of the Baltic to the warm currents of the Black Sea. It was now the largest state in Europe, a massive, multi-ethnic federation that stood as the new guardian of the East. Historians still argue whether this transition was truly a liberation or merely a change of management. But for the average citizen of Kiev in 1362, the difference was tangible. The taxes were lower, the roads were safer, and most importantly, the arbitrary violence of the steppe had ended. The city began to breathe again. Trade flowed up and down the Dnieper without the fear of Mongol raiding parties. The artisans returned to their workshops, the farmers to their fields. Algirdas had delivered on his promise. He had changed no customs, introduced no new gods. But he had removed the fear. He established a new order, a Pax Lithuanica, that would protect these lands for centuries. As he stood on the walls of Kiev, looking south toward the vast, empty steppe where the Mongols had fled, Algirdas must have felt the weight of history shifting. He had pushed the boundary of Europe eastward, reclaiming the lost lands of the Rus from the Asian sphere of influence. The forgotten battle at Blue Waters had not just won a war, it had restored a civilization. The Golden Dome was shining again, not for the Khan, but for the people who lived beneath it. The victory at the Blue Waters did not just redraw a map, it rewrote the destiny of a continent, creating a seismic shift that is all the more profound for how quietly it has been treated by history. In the years that followed 1362, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania solidified its hold on the vast Ukrainian steppe, effectively becoming the largest nation in Europe. It stretched from the grey, choppy waves of the Baltic to the warm, azure currents of the Black Sea, a massive corridor of land that acted as a shield for the rest of Christendom. For the first time in centuries, the terrifying momentum of the East was not just halted, but reversed. The buffer zone that Algirdas carved out of the Mongol Empire meant that when the Golden Horde did eventually regroup and lash out again, their blows fell on the fortified shield of Lithuania rather than the fragile principalities of Central Europe. Poland, Germany, and the developing kingdoms of the West were able to flower into the Renaissance largely because the wolf of the North was standing guard in the backyard, holding the door shut against the chaos of the steppe. Yet despite the monumental scale of this achievement, the Battle of Blue Waters has largely vanished into the mists of memory, becoming a footnote in textbooks dominated by other, louder events. Historians still argue why this is the case, though many point to the simple fact that history is written by the survivors who shout the loudest. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania was eventually absorbed into a union with Poland, and its unique narrative was diluted, while the rise of Muscovy in the east began to monopolize the story of the gathering of the Rus. The Battle of Kulikovo in 1380, fought by the Muscovite prince Dmitry Donskoy against the Mongols, is celebrated with statues and national holidays as the moment the Tatar yoke was broken. But in truth, Kulikovo was a bloody Pyrrhic victory that resulted in Moscow being burned to the ground just 2 years later. In contrast, the victory at Blue Waters was total and enduring. The Golden Horde never again collected tribute from Kiev, and the right bank of Ukraine remained permanently out of their grasp. Algirdas had achieved a more complete liberation 18 years earlier, but because he was a pagan Lithuanian rather than an Orthodox Russian saint, his triumph was quietly pushed into the shadows of the historical archive. There is a certain poetic justice in this obscurity, one that perhaps Algirdas himself, the man who feared his own beard, knew his secrets, would have appreciated. He was never a man for glory or the applause of the crowd. He was a man of results. He built an empire, not on the vanity of monuments, but on the durability of effective governance and strategic silence. The legacy of Blue Waters is not found in songs or holidays, but in the geopolitical reality of Europe. It is found in the survival of the Slavic cultures of the region, which were given the space to breathe and evolve away from the crushing pressure of the Khanate. It is found in the very architecture of the cities that line the Dnieper, which look west toward Europe rather than east toward Asia. The soft conquest proved that integration is stronger than imposition, that a quiet handshake can be more powerful than a mailed fist. The Golden Horde, once the irresistible force of the world, slowly dissolved into a collection of bickering Khanats, the Crimean, the Astrakhan, the Kazan, fragmenting until they were eventually swept away by the tides of time. The terrifying music of the steppe, the whistling arrows and the kettle drums, faded into a whisper, drowned out by the steady, quiet work of civilization that Algirdas had protected. As we stand at the end of this long journey, looking back across the 6 centuries that separate us from that autumn day, the details of the battle, the formations, the armor, the sweat, begin to blur, leaving only the essence of the event. The empire of the wolf has vanished from the maps, its borders erased by modern nation-states, but its ghost still walks the fields of Ukraine. The silence that Algirdas cultivated is now the silence of peace, a peace won by the disciplined few who stood against the screaming many. The story of the Blue Waters is a reminder that the most important turning points in history are not always the most famous ones, and that sometimes the most effective guardians are the ones we never see, the ones who do their work in the dark so that the rest of us can live in the light. The wolf has returned to the forest, the rivers have washed the mud from the banks, and the world has moved on, largely unaware that it owes its shape to a forgotten battle at the edge of the green ocean. The fire has burned down to embers now, casting a soft, pulsing glow against the walls of the room. The shouts of the Mongol warlords and the thunder of the Lithuanian horses have faded completely, leaving only the gentle, rhythmic sound of your own breathing. The history we have walked through tonight, with its clash of empires and its quiet heroes, is settling into the past, becoming just another layer of the earth beneath us. It is time to let go of the dates, the names, and the strategies. Let the heavy armor of the 14th century fall away. Let the tension of the shield wall dissolve, and allow yourself to drift back to the safety of the present moment. The rivers, the Sninuka and the Southern Bug, are still flowing tonight, moving dark and slow under the starlight, their waters whispering the only true secret of history, that everything passes, everything changes, and in the end, peace is the only destination. You are safe, you are warm, and the story is done. The wolf is sleeping, and so should you. Sweet dreams.